So I've been excited for this session, I have to say, and it's always good to keep it towards the end so that we can sort of re-energize everybody. Louise is going to, well, she doesn't know this yet, but Louise is going to be the roving mic person. So as we always say, the only stupid question is the one that never gets asked. So please feel free. I think I know Armon well enough now already to know that he's not shy in answering questions. So if anything on your mind, please do at the end of this, raise your hands and we'll get you the microphone and we can get going. But so I'm going to go back in time, Armon, here, because obviously in the keynote today, we've seen, to your point about announcements, clearly the innovation engines are humming inside Hashi, which is great and great for everybody. But as a founder, so, it's hard to sort of imagine this company being 10, 12 years old, and you've been there since literally first piece of code one. So just kind of going back 12 years to where we are now, what's the journey been like, and what do you see for the next 10 to 12 years?
Ooh, that's a tough question. It's been surreal in many ways. I mean, obviously, I think me and Mitchell's initial view was, we'll give this thing a go, and after 6 months we'll fail and go work at Google, and it was nice while it lasted. So I think that was sort of that was kind of always the attitude, actually, even like years into the company. That was sort of, we had this sort of natural sense of disbelief that like, is this real? Is there really a community? And I distinctly remember the first time it really felt real to me was HashiConf 2015. That was the first time we ever did a user conference. And we booked this tiny venue in Portland, and we're like, can we even get like 100 people to show up? Like, we were super nervous. It'll be like, the 5 of us who work at HashiCorp there and nobody else. And we ended up selling it out totally. It was like 300 people, and it was like the first time we kind of got a user community together. And people came in from all over the world. We had people who flew in from Japan. We had people here from Europe. And that was the first time it felt like, oh, okay, this is like there's like a real user base. There's like real people in the world who actually use this stuff. And I think the other thing I remember was like, so it's like my dirty secret is I'm actually not from an infrastructure background. Like I was always on the app side of the house, and I was always just pissed off at Mitchell and his team because I was like, why do I always have to file a ticket and wait for you? And so, I was like, okay, well, we'll start this company and it'll take us 3-4 years to figure this whole infrastructure thing out. I mean, like how hard can it be? We're just provisioning some servers. And 12 years in, it's like, okay, we still have another 12 years of roadmap. So, I guess there's a little bit more to it than I thought. And so I think to me, when I think about the next 12 years, it's like, to me, what feels wrong is how hard everything still is, right? It's still, when you attend these talks and you just realize like multi-cloud is hard.
Sure.
Developers still, can barely figure out how to deploy things, let alone when you start talking about, at scale in a secure way, in a performant way. So to me, it still feels like the next 12 years is about, great, we made cloud possible. Now, how do we make cloud easy? Right. And I think that's a very different journey. And I think, you can see a lot of the announcements that we made were sort of in that vein, right? It's how do we do this as a managed service? How do we be more opinionated? How can we be more prescriptive out of the box? How can it be secure by default? So I think that's a lot of the kind of stuff that we're continuing to focus on. And I think, last time I thought, it'll only take 3-4 years. Now maybe I'm a little less naive. So I think we'll still be at it for a while.
It's interesting when you listen to Vodafone, you listen to G Research, you listen to BT, you listen to Barclays, all very different businesses in their own right. And I suppose in our respective worlds, we spend a lot of time with customers trying to understand where are you, where are things going. We had a great panel a little bit earlier with HMCTS, a government organization doing cool stuff. I mean, there's an oxymoron, right, straight away. I didn't mean that, Felix, by the way. But it always fascinates me, like the journey and where customers are at. And I think one of the things that really resonates, and we see it a lot in any Hashi presentation, you'll see the cloud operating model, which, by the way, isn't really a Hashi thing. It's more of an observation about how IT operations generally need to evolve from the days of ITIL, which I'm sure many of you have got the scars here from ITIL and COBIT and TOGAF and all the things that I was exposed to when I was a little bit younger and more naive. But one of the things that we've been focused on is the maturity model, which I think is really good because it gets to be more prescriptive about here's how you move through these phases, and here are the use cases, and here are the products that help. From your point of view, and you spend a lot of time with customers as I do, where do you think people really are on the journey. Because somebody asked me the other day, like, where's Hashi at? And I'm like, you got to remember, this is like, even though it's a 12-year-old organization, like what we're doing is super early in the evolution of big companies. Armon and I were just chatting a little bit, everything's hard, as you said, right? Enterprise is hard, technology is hard, legacy is hard, people are hard, process is hard, everything's hard, right?
And we sit at the intersection of all of that.
That's exactly my point, right? So if you were to say, okay, look, I spoke to 1,000 customers last year, whatever the number is. Where would you say, generally, where are we at in the evolution?
So early, and I'd break it out even by geo, because I think it's a little bit different in different markets. And it's funny, because in some sense we had these sort of almost, I'll call them false starts, right? Like I think back to Consul is one of our oldest tools. It dates back to 2014. And I remember when we launched Consul, like instantly we had these sort of web scale folks adopting it. We had like eBay and PayPal and Twitch and these massive organizations, because those organizations were at that scale and level of maturity so far ahead because they had to be because of the size of their operation.
Of course.
And then it was like no one else adopted Consul for the next like 7 years. Because everyone else you talk to about network automation and service discovery and like service mesh would look at you like you had two heads.
Sure.
They're like, what are you even talking about, right? And so I think it was like you saw this gap of, I'll call almost these sort of cloud natives or web monsters that were sort of forced into some of this stuff because of scale, and then the rest of the market who was sort of playing catch up on a lot of these techniques. So for me, when I sort of really look at it and we think about it through that maturity model of like, hey, it's infrastructure as code at the base, and then it's moving up to, Vault and security and things like that. Honestly, I'd say the broad market is really just getting to the point where I would say infrastructure as code is now becoming like a well-accepted standard, right? I think the U.S. generally is maybe 18 months ahead of what we tend to see, in Europe. So I think it was like maybe about 18 months ago, I would have made the same statement about some of the U.S. organizations. Now they're kind of moving on to, okay, now we can move to higher level. Maybe we're starting to do vault automation and move beyond static credential management into some of the more dynamic secrets. But to me, it just feels like such early innings, right? Like you still, I think in many organizations, it's like it might be the cloud team is on board with Terraform, but then you go talk to the networking team, right? And then they're like, nope, file a ticket, I'll log in, we manually provision, it takes you, whatever, 6 months to update a firewall rule. And then it's like, oh, you're talking to the PKI team, and they're like, file a ticket, we'll manually mint a certificate, I give it a name, we hold a birthday party for it when it turns 1 year old, and like that's what it feels like, with some of these teams. So, I think it's still so early, and then it's like you go to talk to that team about, hey, I need a certificate every 24 hours because I'm going to do mutual TLS and service mesh, and again, you get stared at like, I have two heads, right? So to me, I think, if I think about it as like a journey, it's like, are we 20% if I'm picking a number, right? Like to me, it's like getting the foundational infrastructure as code first, then getting to some of the true identity pieces, and then you get onto sort of high level networking and application automation. But it still feels like we have a ways to go.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember a famous quote. There was a guy by the name of Cameron Haidt, and this is to kind of give you the context of where we are in the journey. He was a VP at Gartner who researched virtualization. Many of you may have heard of him or read some of his stuff. And when virtualization, I'm talking over a decade ago, when virtualization became mainstream and VMs were the atomic unit of currency in data centers, he made an observation. It said before virtualization, it used to take 6 weeks to request and provision a physical server. After virtualization, guess how long it takes to request and provision a virtual machine? And it was exactly the same time, right? Because even though the technology had changed, the rest of the stuff hadn't caught up. So it kind of feels like, you've laid the groundwork over the last 12 years, and now there's kind of a wind that's kind of blowing in that direction. Would that be reasonable?
Yeah, exactly. And I think some of it is just, it's the organizational change that takes a long time, right? Like, I talked to a lot of organizations that it took 10 years to finish the VMware adoption, 10 years. And when you think about that, it's like you imaged a machine and you just put two machines on the same box. That was the concept, right? I mean, it was like, and that took a decade. And so now when you're like, throw away your ClickOps, throw away tickets. By the way, your perimeter security is dead. Change that too. Everything is now dynamic. You think about how simple, in some sense, virtualization was pretty simple. It was like, it's two boxes in one. Okay, great, right? When we're now talking about this transformation at every layer of the stack to infrastructure as code, identity-based security, zero trust, ephemeral containers, it's like, yeah, is a decade unreasonable? I don't know. Yeah. I mean, if virtualization took 10, maybe it's not so unreasonable, right?
So going back to the keynote again, and Dave pulled out some I'm going to keep plugging the cloud survey, by the way, because it's really, really good. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, please do. It's a great piece of research that builds on the last couple of years, but there's some really interesting pieces in it. And if you think about the last one that Dave focused on, which was the number one ranked challenge, is the skills gap. Right? So we've talked about that, a number of times, and I think anybody in the industry would say that as this stuff, to your point, gets more complicated, we have a real interesting dichotomy, because there's a lot of people who've been in tech a long time who are burned out and disillusioned and can't learn new stuff. And there's a lot of new people coming in who have no idea how the real world works, and kind of like there's this kind of odd sort of void in the middle. If you think about the sort of the skills gap, and again, in the same conversations that we have with customers, what do you think organizations could collectively be doing? I mean, clearly the technology and the automation back to reducing the cognitive load plays a part in addressing the skills gap, because you let the technology work for you, but you've got to have an organization that can build that thing in the first place, right? Yeah. So from a practical perspective, what advice do you give to customers as they set out on the journey of really understanding how to analyze what they have, understanding where the gaps are, and then filling those gaps with the right talent?
Yeah, I think it's two things. I mean, I think part of it, to your point, is there is an element of like bringing in fresh blood helps, because I think I've seen organizations where you get sort of a stagnant pool, and people they haven't seen other things, and so it's like there's sort of an aversion to necessarily trying new things. So I do think it's like bringing in some circulation and fresh blood is helpful. I think two is an investment in upskilling, right? And I think that's been an area where some organizations are really, really good at it, because I think in some sense a lot of the change fear, and I think some of the passive resistance you get comes from the sort of natural human fear of, hey, will the automation make my role obsolete, right? Will it mean that, the company consolidates away some of this stuff? Or, and so I think there's that fear leads to, I think, a natural sort of passive resistance within an org. It's not necessarily an active one, but it's a slowing down and a hitting of brakes all over the place, right? Which sort of avoids the changes. And I think the only way to get around that is for people to see what their role is going to be in the new world, and helping invest in them by upskilling, right? And I think, to me, it's like where I've seen this over and over again is it's like, what's the smallest unit of automation that gets people to have that aha moment and then invest in it, right? And I think, to me, it's like, oddly enough, the one that I've seen it over and over again is you take a classic sysadmin and you show them Packer. Right? And you take them through, because it's like a very basic, it's like, but like how many million times have they brought up a VM, manually installed a package, done a snapshot, blah, blah, blah. And you're like, okay, great. Now we're going to write 4 lines of bash script, hand it to Packer. You're going to Packer run, and it's going to spit out an AMI for you. And then great. Now you make 2-line change and you get a VMware image, and a 2-line change and you get an Azure image. And you almost see them go wide-eyed when the first time they run Packer, and they're like, holy shit. And you're like, and now you can put that thing into Jenkins. And it's like, you come back a week later and they're like, I Packered everything, right? Like I have 1,000 Packer images now, because they had that aha moment, yep. Right? And then in that moment, they saw their role change, where they're like, I'm solving the same problem. I'm delivering the same business value, but I'm now doing it 1,000 times more efficiently than it was before. And now I can go on and solve these other business problems. And now that person that was probably the person who was fighting you tooth and nail is your number one change advocate, because right. They're like, I love Packer. I can't even imagine going back to pointing and clicking. Where 2 weeks ago, they're like, I'd rather stab you in the throat than talk about automation, right? And you're like, okay, that was a big about face. So I think it's like you got to kind of show people that light and take them on the journey where they feel like, hey, I have a role in this, and Packer wasn't that hard. It took me 20 minutes to figure out how to do this. And what I tell people all the time is like, we can teach an average intern Terraform in a week. Like, it's just not rocket science, right? So I think if you invest in people and give them that time to go take this, to go take the Terraform certification, spend a week playing with the online thing, it's like, it's not rocket science, right? And I think it's like a lot of time, it's like I had a few conversations at the conference where networking teams are starting to use it. But it's that thing where it's like, you just got to let them dip their toe and feel like, oh, I can actually automate my Palo or my F5 or my, my whatever. And they see what their role is in automation, and I think that's how you bring people along with you, right?
So on that sort of a similar theme around, the evolution of, and it's funny, when I think back on the classic triangle of people process, I've been talking about that for 30 years, and it's amazing how it's still relevant. The dimensions change, and what takes root at each point changes, of course. But so if we think about, let's say the process and the people and the technology. If I imagine a triangle, and in the middle of that, what comes to me in an ethereal vision is platform engineering, platform team, yep. Right? So that's kind of new. I want to read something to you, actually, because this and I'd like to get your response as well with a simple gasp. I read that Gartner, this was just last week by the way, that Gartner expects that by 2026, 80% of software engineering organizations will establish platform teams as internal providers of reusable services, components, and tools for application delivery. Platform engineering will ultimately solve the central problem of cooperation between software developers and operators. No. Thank you. There was a gasp. But I don't know whether that number's high or not. And I suppose what it doesn't talk about is the maturity of the platform team as well, right? Because you could have, one person behind a curtain and call it a platform team, right? But you recently did a famous Armon video, and has anybody seen the famous Armon videos, by the way, that are dotted all over YouTube? If you haven't, and you're new to Hashi, or you're new to some of the things that we're talking about here from concepts, Armon's videos are just like they're awesome. I'd suggest watching them on a big screen with headphones because they're also incredibly soothing as well as being informational. So you recently did one on platform teams, right? And what platform teams are all about. So for those who haven't seen it, and I assume many of you haven't, just give us the highlights of what was in the video and what some practical recommendations are for organizations that are stepping either into it for the first time or trying to scale out the platform team.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And I think it kind of ties into sort of what Dave was talking about this morning, which is like we almost see these kind of phases, right? Every organization goes through, which is like phase one is that very kind of tactical ad hoc where there's usually no central platform. It's just sort of great, every business unit, every app team kind of go figure it out, do whatever you want. And so I think organizationally that works in terms of being able to go fast. Each team doesn't have, it's light on coordination. Downside is it's also light on process, light on consistency, light on governance, right? So it's great for enablement, but has a bunch of other challenges, right? So I think that's okay. You go down that path to first learn and figure out, but you quickly make a mess. And so then I think you kind of come around to saying, okay, well now, obviously if I want to have some level of consistency, that implies some level of standardization. Right? And standardization involves some level of taking choice away from teams. And so this is where you always get that intersection of the standardization of a tool naturally means I'm taking choice away from other people, which now is your intersection of organizational structure, people, tooling, right? And you get that sort of, fun Gordian knot. So I think that often is where we then see the platform team emerge. Now, I think there's a choice as a platform team, which is like, what's our scope, right? Like, what do you want to take on, right? And I think when we zoom out, our view is in the fullness of time, the answer should be every non-functional requirement of an app dev team, right? Because otherwise, it's like any one of those things you pull out, by definition, every app team is going to redefine. So if I say, platform team doesn't do observability. Okay, well, great. Now you have 50 app teams that do observability 50 different ways. Have fun with that, right? Or you have 50 different, GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, whatever, right? So anything you pull out, you're going to have times 50. So over time, the answer should be standardize everything that's non-functional, and the app dev teams only own their business logic, right? Because that's ultimately what you care about. That's obviously an impractical start point for most platform teams, because you're saying, great, day one, I have 3 people, and there's an entire SDLC. How am I going to deliver that in a box? It's impossible. You're not going to, right? So then we sort of look at that and say, okay, how can I decompose platform in a pragmatic way to say, what are the cut points logically that I can deliver chunks of that and have an incremental roadmap without sort of cutting off the business for 3 years and saying, I'm going to go in a cave, build the perfect platform, and then kind of reemerge and nobody build anything in the meantime, right? Because no one's going to do that. So to me, it's like I sort of, if I'm drawing it on the whiteboard, I sort of outline, there's sort of an L shape that I end up drawing, right? And the L shape is sort of like, if you think about it through the lens of an SDLC, it's what's the, where's first touch from code to first touch to production, right? And I think that tends to be your version control through your CI/CD tooling through something like Terraform. That becomes, I'll call it the minimum first cut, because that becomes an infrastructure as code pipeline. Now I can say, great, I can check in code into my GitHub. I can go through GitHub Actions or Jenkins. Then I have a CI/CD environment to test my app. I can go through a Terraform cloud to actually provision it and have logical controls. And so that can be my first cut. But above that line, I tell each app team, yeah, do whatever you want, right? Great. One team wants Kubernetes, one team wants ECS, one team wants Nomad run free. Above that line, I haven't standardized, because now I have breathing space as a platform team to deliver my infrastructure layer in a robust way, and now I can move up the stack. And now my next problem might be, maybe I should do observability standards. So I say I'm going to do Datadog or whatever it is, right, as a standard, and now that becomes the second piece of my platform. I think invariably, to me, the next piece that you got to solve above the infrastructure piece is the security layer. Right? Because I think if you're not managing it through an identity-based lens, if it becomes great, I SSH in and manually put, certificates on box,
Yeah.
Very hard to do that in a secure way, very hard to do that in an end-to-end automated way. So to me, then it's like the next layer becomes, okay, great, how do you bake identity and the security piece for the platform? But again, leave the application layer up to the teams in terms of whatever middleware you want, whatever runtime you want, and then slowly kind of chip away at it until effectively what it becomes in the end is a platform as a service, right? Where what you should come to me and say, here's my Java code or here's my C# code, go. And as a developer, do I care? Did it turn into a container and it's running on Kubernetes? Did you package it as a Lambda and it's running somewhere? Is it running on, whatever, it might be micro VMs running on burstable instances, right? Like as a developer, I frankly shouldn't care. I want to give you my Java code and say, you run it. And great, the rest is sort of the platform team's problem. But I think that journey to really get mature on that, it's like, we work with customers that are ultra mature where they can go from code commit of a Java app through a full pipeline into production in 5 minutes. But those are large platform teams that have been working on it for years, right? Like you're just not going to get there overnight, right?
Yeah, I think that advocating for guardrails that are malleable, I think is smart, right? Because I think if we, just like we've done over the last 30, 40, 50 years, whatever it is, the more you put people in a box, the more inclined they are to color outside the rails, right? So I think if we try and say, this is the only way you can do that, well, guess what? Pretty quickly, somebody's going to go, that doesn't work for me, so I'm going to create my own way of doing it. Right? So I think perhaps the vision, bigger sort of macro zoomed out level is we think about landing zones. We think about landing zones for different clouds to support multi-cloud. We think about a platform area and an application area for the landing zones, and we work backward from that, saying, hey, here's how you commit. Right. And once you've committed, you choose what you think is right, and then the rest of it goes into the guardrails that are slightly bigger than trying to put people in a standard box.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. So I'm cognizant at the time, and I want to give you some, but I'm going to ask you one. It wouldn't be a tech conference without generative AI, right? Obviously. Was there a groan there from someone? So we're going to talk. I'm going to ask about generative AI, but I'm going to ask about it in the context of kind of what I think Hashi's really, really good at. So if you take the notion of reducing cognitive load and you say that's whenever you listen to Armon, he'll talk about that all the time, right? It's one of the fundamental value propositions of Hashi is to get stuff out of the way, right? To let developers do what they're good at. If you think about what's happening in the world of generative AI and getting technology to help us to do stuff that we're good at but takes a lot of time, like writing resumes or writing music or writing songs or doing anything else that we've currently seen in this sort of winter or the approaching winter of generative AI. If I think about that and I kind of join some dots and some other trends that are sort of in the industry, whether that's low code, no code, or automation, or I could see a world at some point where, and I had to explain this to somebody the other day, and I said, do you remember Dreamweaver? And then they kind of looked at me like, what are you talking about? Right. So if you grew up when I did, Dreamweaver was like, oh my God, this is incredible. Because I couldn't read HTML at first until I learned how to do it. I had no idea what CSS was until I learned how to do it. And there I am just dragging things into this UI and it's spitting out code. And I'm like, this is magic. This is absolutely magic. Then you think about other things where, we've got natural language processing built into everything. How likely is it, and I'll give you the opportunity to think about this, that at some point you'll be able to declare what you want an application to do, where you want it to run, how you want the business logic to work, how you want it to integrate, and the rest of generative AI will work out how to deliver it for you. It'll give you infrastructure choices. It'll give you the most optimized cost piece of it. It'll give you the most optimized performance. It'll give you the best code it can. Even if it doesn't become what you actually deploy, I think getting to that point where you say, this is what I want my application to do. I don't think that's too far off. So in the context of your crystal ball and the sort of the future of everything, how big an opportunity or a threat do you see to development teams from generative AI as a thing?
Right. No, it's a super good question. I mean, to me, first of all, I love the Dreamweaver analogy. But I'll throw a different analogy at you, which is like, how many programmers did you fire when you went from assembly to Python? You probably hired 10 times as many programmers.
Exactly.
Right? And so to me, I think about it as that same thing. If I look at today, almost what it feels like we're doing the equivalent as at an infrastructure level, we're at like an assembly level, right? Versus what you'd really like to be is at a Python level to say, great, yeah, just give me a Java app with a MySQL backend running in Google, it should be on Kubernetes, blah, 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 and then translate it to the assembly for me. And I think that translation to the assembly is where the generative AI will fit, right? And that's not to say you never need to go down to the assembly level in the same way that today, if you want to write, high performance, application, you do go down to the assembly level. You want to use every instruction that, Intel and NVIDIA have. Like, yeah, you got to be at that level to eke out, every last cycle from your CPU. But if you're writing a general web app that generates hello world, are you writing assembly, or, you're just like, you're spitting out, JavaScript that takes, 12 billion CPU instructions just to load, right? So you don't care because you're like, whatever, it's a commodity app and who cares? And I think it's like 90% of what we do is probably in that bucket where it's like, yeah, if I'm building, some high frequency trading thing where I super care about every last millisecond, yeah, I'm probably going to write the assembly in the sense of the infrastructure. But if it's like put, Tomcat on a server somewhere and this thing does 4 requests a second and like, who cares? Like, yeah, it's probably going to spit out something that's good enough, right? So to me, as I think about the generative AI possibility, it's on a few sides. I think one is on the side of how do you lower the bar for generating these configurations and kind of move us up stack where I can give it high level input and it'll generate 95% correct, Terraform, for example. And then great, if you want to fine tune the edges of it, knock yourself out. But if it's a generic Tomcat app or whatever, it's probably good enough. And then I think it's actually on the reverse side of it, right? Which is if you think about what happens for most large estates, it's very easy to put a thing in cloud. Right? In the same way it was easy to spin up a VM. What's hard is to maintain that infrastructure at scale, where you wake up one day and you're like, oh, I have 200,000 VMs and half my infrastructure is from 20 years ago and nobody even knows what the hell is running in this estate, right? That's where I think there's an opportunity to actually synthesize and summarize and help provide context for an environment without having to go through that sort of deep dive exploratory work to basically reconstruct a picture of what the hell is running in the environment, right? So imagine you're a new employee, you join and you push a button and you say, hey, tell me about the environment. And it's just like, okay, great. At a high level, you're multi-cloud, you have 5,000 apps, 3,000 are in this cloud, 1,000 are here. And then you can say, okay, well, now tell me more about what's running in AWS. Okay, tell me about my account structure. And I think that becomes almost a more natural way. It's almost like when you get your architect in a room and you're having a conversation with them. And you're like, hey, tell me about the application architecture. Yeah, it's a microservice thing. It looks like this. It's a load balancer, right? Like, the architect doesn't spit out 12 million lines of code until you go read this.
Some do.
Right? Yeah. But I think it's like that sense of like, could you have almost a trusted infrastructure advisor, which in some sense is a generative AI, and you're having a conversation about your infrastructure with it. And that conversation can be enriched with telemetry. It can be enriched with infrastructure as code. It can be enriched with, observing the estate and providing much richer information that otherwise is trapped in the head of a handful of architects, right? Or maybe not because they left the company and now nobody has the context, right?
Sure. So it's not quite as much science fiction as it seems, then, really. No. So, okay. Well, I could riff with you all day on this stuff, Armon, but I feel like we need to throw it out to a few questions here. So, Connor. For those who haven't met Connor, you can't really miss Connor. So he's at the back with the microphone. So happy to take any questions from anyone. Yes, we have one here, Connor. Make sure the question's for Armon, by the way, because.
Sorry, I've written it down so I didn't get it wrong. Hi, nice to meet you. I'm Nina. I graduated university last year, and I'm now 8 months into my first ever job in public cloud engineering at JP Morgan, which has been a serious learning journey, to say the very least about it all. I was wondering what advice, both professional and public cloud specific, you would give to someone in my position who's just embarked on the start of their career. Thank you.
Oh, okay, that's a really good question.
Wow, great question.
Really, really good. You definitely picked a complex environment to learn in first, for sure. It's a good question. I think in some sense to me, it's like what's repeated over and over is like the fundamentals in some sense don't really change, right? Like, if you think about virtualization to containerization, right? It's like once you understand the core concepts of like what's really happening, it's like, okay, it's bin packing, it's system, it's hardware abstraction, right? Like a lot of those are the same. So I think investing the time to really get familiar with the fundamentals of what's happening, regardless of the specific technology, because that changes flavor and shape, on an hourly basis. But I think once you're comfortable with those fundamentals of, certainly at the compute layers, storage, networking, databases, it's like at the heart of it, it's like a lot of it just gets repackaged. And I think once you have that basic level of comfort, it's like, okay, great, a new thing comes out with Lambda function. You're like, okay, great, it's just it's effectively a time slice version of virtualization, right? And so it lets you sort of understand these concepts a lot faster once you're familiar with the fundamentals. So I think going deep and getting comfortable with the fundamentals, I'd say is super important. I think the other one that's maybe less specific to a cloud engineering role would be, actually, and this will sound very strange, is investing in communication and public speaking. You will all find this very strange. I used to be a horrible public speaker. I used to hate it. I used to be a ball of nerves, and now it's basically my full-time job. And I think it's communication I think is a superpower, because I think a lot of people focus on pure technical skill. And at some point you hit a wall with that, because at some point, whatever knowledge you have needs to leave these four walls, right? And at that point, the limitation is not your technical knowledge, it's your communication skill, right? And whether you're influencing other people on a technical decision, whether you're trying to convince people on a project, architecture, technical design, whatever it is, the limitation of your success is not your technical prowess, it's your communication skill, right? So I think investing in that and getting super comfortable with it is a superpower.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I'd just add, if you can, and I don't know what the structure's like in JP, but find a technical mentor and find a business mentor. Because many times, you come across people who work in technology who have no idea why they're doing what they're doing. And I don't mean that in a bad, it's a fact, right? Because people are just so specialized in certain things, but when you actually follow the chain of why, and you can use like 5 whys techniques and things like that to get to like, why are we actually doing this? So get down to first principles. It's really important from the business perspective, because if you can mix business with technology, I think you'll have a very unique skill set that we've not really seen in the industry. And I think it's about time that, especially females in technology did that more so.
Yeah.
There must be other questions, surely. It's not often you get Armon. Felix.
They know we're here between happy hour. That's the key.
Well, I think we should keep it longer until we've had enough questions.
Hi, Armon. It's a pleasure meeting you. First time ever. I just have a question around boundary and VPN. I'm trying to put the split in my head. Could you sort of elaborate a bit more? Is boundary going to be another VPN or that sort of capability for organizations, or is it something totally different?
Yes to both. Yeah. And what I mean by that is it's not going to become a VPN in the sense that we are trying to replace it, but not by recreating a VPN. And what I mean by that is the challenge I have with a VPN is that it bridges you onto a network at a very low layer. It dumps you on at either level 2 or layer 3. And it's basically like, great, you're now just on the virtual network and you can do anything, right? And so the challenge with that is I think it brings with it all of the problems that network security has, right? Which is, okay, now you can move east-west. Now you have to think about IP addresses. Now you have to think about basically trying to secure applications, but at a network level. And I think we were never good at that. And my sense is you're never going to be good at it in cloud because it's too dynamic, right? Like things are coming and going, IPs are too dynamic. It's too much of an ephemeral environment. And so I think that whole approach is wrong, right? Or maybe not. It's dated. It was of a time. So I think the goal with boundary is in some sense you get rid of your VPN, right? So if we talk about HashiCorp, for example, we have no VPN into our production environment. The only way into production is boundary. Boundary runs at the edge of the network. So in the same way you had a VPN gateway that sort of straddled the public-private network and you connected to the gateway, you do boundary in the same way. Boundary gateway sits at the edge of your network, so it listens to public incoming traffic and it can kind of bridge into the private network. But unlike a VPN, it never bridges a user onto the network, right? So a user's never in your network space. They can never move east-west to random IP addresses. They can never do random DNS queries. They can't, listen to multicast. So the only thing they can do is basically, if they're authorized, boundary will tell them, great, you can connect to the gateway, and then it'll tell you, here's the 5 things you, Armon, as a developer can access. You can access, your web app in Kubernetes, your RDS database, your, whatever, your Redis cache, etc. Here's the 5 things you're authorized to get to. And then I can initiate a connection to any one of those 5, but boundary will directly connect me to that rather than just put me on the network. And so then the key is this lets us move to an identity-based set of rules, right? So I say, Armon, who is a member of the development group, has access to this set of logical services. I don't want to care about IPs. I don't want to care about, at that level because it's too dynamic. I talk about users, groups have access to logical service. 2 is I never put Armon on the network, right? I never have actual network access. And then 3 is we can actually get much more active in things like session management, credential injection, et cetera, where VPN has no idea what the traffic is above it, right? It's like I'm just going to copy packets back and forth and it could care less what you're doing on top of the VPN. Versus boundary wants to be session aware. So great, if you're connected to a database, I want to know what queries you're running. If you're connected to a web service, what web request did you make? So in that sense, it's almost like a merger of traditional VPN, traditional firewall, and traditional PAM into sort of like one layer, right? Where you don't have to manage 3 different sets of rules. It's one set of controls, right? And that eliminates then, a whole set of management, but also a whole set of downsides around IP layer management and network layer access and all that kind of good stuff. So yes, so it's yes to both your questions.
If it helps, Felix, the way I think about it as well, just it's not a network analogy, but if you think about sort of traditional Windows or NTLM Active Directory, somebody puts somebody in a group, in the wrong group, and applies the permissions, then you get access to what you shouldn't get access to, right? Which is the east-west analogy. If you move to, initial SAML or anything else that is claims-based, your claim is only valid in the context of you accessing the app. So the way I think about it a little bit like that as well, which, if I've got a SAML assertion and it's valid for one app, I can't move to other apps because it's only in the context of that app. Right. So I think about it, sort of that way to make it clear with me as well. But before Armon explained it, but now I understand it even better. So. Richard?
Hi, it's
Oh, I'm sorry. It's Barclays versus HSBC. This should be pretty interesting.
Hi, Armon. It's Jill Murray from HSBC. The Explorer functionality on Terraform looked great this morning. Are there plans to expand that to cover Vault namespace visibility? And secondary question, can you offer some reassurance that you'll continue to develop and enhance on-prem self-managed Vault as well as HCP?
Yeah, so two very good questions. Yeah, so I think the Terraform Workspace Explorer that we talked about today, very much for Terraform, both cloud and enterprise. So I'll come back to the second question in a second. I think what you'll see is a very equivalent set of functionality, both for Vault, and then you kind of saw some of it with Consul as well, with the HCP Consul management plane. And I think what you're going to generally see from us is it's that elevation of delivering not only the control planes, right, in the form, if you think about Terraform, Vault, Consul, they're really control planes, but now starting to focus on what's that management plane aspect that you need as well, right? So things like Terraform Workspace Visibility, Vault, we have a Vault Insights, which will provide very similar type of reporting and dashboard capability, but for Vault, and then HCP Consul, same sort of a thing for the console side. So I think you're going to continue to see us invest in how do we move from just the control plane function to, I think, okay, how do I do lifecycle management and governance and reporting? That's really a management plane capability, and we're going to continue to add more there. I think to the second part of the question, our view is private data center is not going anywhere, right? And I think if we've learned anything over the last year, I think a lot of people are revisiting their decision, which was all cloud, all workloads, as people are getting their bills. And they're like, is that right, the number of zeros here? And so I think a lot of people are now, the last 2 years was in some sense a little bit, I'll call it like rah cloud, regardless of what the TCO was, right? And I think what we saw a lot of was like, we're going to take this old legacy app, we're going to move it from VMware to Amazon and uplift our spend 20%. And you're like, and what was the benefit? And they're like, it's cloud. And you're like, great. I'd like your CFO, right? And so I think we're seeing people rationalize that now again and be like, okay, no, there has to be like a real reason we're doing it. It can't just be cloud for the sake of it. So, and I think when you then look at that and say, okay, well, extrapolate that out 20, 30 months from now, does that mean you're going to be 100% cloud? No, probably not. You're going to have some portion of your workload that, it's probably always data center. So for us, you're starting to see kind of the lens in which we're taking on that is very much a hybrid one, right? So with like Consul, we talked about the linking of self-managed clusters. You'll see a similar thing for HCP Vault to be able to do the Vault reporting. Because our view is there will always be a blend of cloud-delivered, HashiCorp services where you're consuming directly from HCP. There'll always be a set of customers who want to self-manage, whether for data sovereignty or security, privacy, whatever reasons. And so how do we support that kind of hybrid from the management plane? And we see that as sort of that is an end state in our view. It's like, I don't think you ever get to 100% cloud.
I think we have time for what, Richard? You have the final say.
Hello, Richard Hughes, Barclays Bank. Hi, good to meet you. I've got 3 subtle questions, so apologies in this. Right, so you've got a really good broad portfolio of products now, right, and it's increasing. So first of all, are there any good anecdotes about any of these products and how they were created? For example, was like Boundary because of your own frustrations of lockdown, remote access, or things like that? Second one, a bit more serious, is obviously as you spread, are you worried about spreading yourself too wide with finite resources as a company and becoming like, rather than focusing on those individual products? And then finally, how do you prioritize your finite set of resources on which product is now going to get the development? So,
okay, all really good questions. And I think we have a pretty good framework that actually might answer kind of all 3 of them a little bit. So the way we think about it internally is we sort of bucket our product investments into 3 groups, right? We have sort of what I call core products. That's Terraform and Vault, right? And we've shared on sort of public calls. That's like 80% of revenue for us. Then we have our next category, which is emerging product. That's really Consul and now Boundary. where we feel like, okay, it's a relatively mature product. The market is at a point where the market is sort of seeing the demand for it. Because I think with some of our products, they're in some sense potentially, they have been ahead of the market by a number of years. So I think there's a market timing question. So I think the emerging products are then that sort of second bucket. And then our third bucket is, I'll call it incubating, right? Which is like, hey, we're making a bet in a product that is either very young or we think still a few years ahead of, broad market appeal. And so you can kind of think about those three buckets as sort of right-sizing the resource investment. So our core products get the lion's share of R&D dollars, followed by emerging, followed by a much smaller investment in the incubating products. So that's how we make sure that the sort of dollars are kind of right-sized between them, and we don't get sort of too out of whack. In terms of maybe the second question, which is like, how do we avoid sort of getting too far wide? I think it goes back to that framework, right? Which is like, okay, we'll stay very focused on the core and emerging products from a resource concentration. And some of these things are very small and cheap products for it to be able to incubate, right? We can put 4 people basically and build a net new service on HCP. And that's enough to be able to trial something and work with some design partners to say, hey, does this thing have legs? Should we invest in it further or should we kill this investment, right? So I think we can be very measured in those investments without it becoming sort of a distraction to us. And then I think, so maybe in reverse order now, getting to your first question, sort of the anecdotes of how these products came to be. A lot of them, the newer ones especially, have been driven by, customer interaction, right? So if I think about Boundary, it came out of, I don't even know, having 50 customers in a row tell me, we really love Vault, but we really hate our PAM vendor. Like, can you give us a thing that is Vault-like, but for PAM? And I think once you heard that the first time, you're like, who knows, man, this customer is just weird. And then when you hear it the 10th time, the 30th time, the 50th time, you're like, okay, there must be something here, right? This is clearly like, there's a gap in the market. So I think for something like Boundary, that's what was the impetus for us. It's like we were very much in the secret management market. We're like, oh, that's a solved problem. Nobody needs us in that market. And then I think when 50 people are like, please help us, you're like, okay, we'll build you something. And I think that's what led to Boundary was like, effectively, if you think about the principles of Boundary, it's sort of an agglomeration of our other products, right? It's sort of an infrastructure as code lens on configuration, obviously from Terraform. It's a very dynamic, oriented approach to it, very much like, Vault. And it's a very sort of service catalog oriented view the way Consul takes it, right? Which is to say, hey, who knows what the IPs are, they come and go. So we sort of blended the philosophies of our other products to build sort of what we consider a modern approach to the problem. But it was very much just customer driven. Waypoint, actually the same thing. When I looked at our super mature customers operating at scale, and we said, hey, what's your developer experience? Right? Did you teach your developers Nomad? Did you teach them, Terraform? And I think what we saw at all of these sort of at scale, web scale type firms was they're like, no. We have these sort of internal developer portals that abstract the infrastructure, right? So our developers never know about Nomad. They never know about Terraform. They just come in and say, hey, it's a Java app. It needs a MySQL. It needs a Redis. Go. And then, under the hood, we're translating that to a Nomad and Terraform and Vault. But the developers don't interact with that. And so I think when we saw that pattern over and over again, it was like, okay, how do you do that in a generic way where we can almost what Terraform did in an infrastructure layer, which is as an ops team, you don't build the providers necessarily, but you give us the configuration, and then Terraform's the engine that glues it. Can we do the same thing at an app layer where as an ops team, we'd say, this is my platform. Great, I have Kubernetes and Datadog and Vault and Terraform, and here's my pieces. Great, you give us the configuration and we'll glue that together into a developer experience that sort of hides the details, right, and hides the plumbing. But it really came out of, frankly, observing what our own mature customers were doing and being like, hey, that's a pretty good pattern. And I think the actual internal realization was we couldn't train our own developers on things like Nomad, right? Because they were like, this seems too complicated. I'm a JavaScript developer. Like, I don't care about this thing. I just want to like deploy the app. And so for a long time, we had an internal tool called Waffles that was basically a Slack bot. So you would talk to Waffles and say, hey, deploy this app to the staging environment or the test environment or whatever. And Waffles was the abstraction layer on top of Terraform, Consul, Vault, Nomad. And so it was like, okay, if we're doing it and all of our mature customers are doing it, how do we productize that? And that became Waypoint, effectively. Yeah.
Armon, thank you so much. Absolute pleasure. Thank you for the questions, everybody. We've got a couple more minutes left. Louise is going to do the wrap-up. And I hope you enjoyed that Q&A session. Very enlightening. So, Armon, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you all for coming.